The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the grand courtroom, cutting through the murmurs that had been building like a quiet storm. Order! Judge Marcus Reed's deep, authoritative voice carried through the chamber, silencing the scattered whispers. His sharp, calculating eyes swept over the room before settling on the young woman standing at the defense table. Olivia Carter. She stood with quiet confidence, her blazer neatly pressed, her posture unwavering. 18 years old. Too young, they thought, too inexperienced, and yet she didn't flinch. Judge Reed leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing as he regarded her with an amused smirk. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone laced with disbelief. "Are you telling me that you, an 18-year-old, are representing the defendant in a criminal case?" For a moment, the silence held. Then, a soft ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. From the back, someone muttered just loudly enough to be heard, "A kid playing dress-up as a lawyer." Over at the prosecution's table, Jonathan Pierce, a seasoned attorney with decades of experience, leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly tailored suit. The corners of his mouth curled into a smirk. "Miss Carter," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension, "are you sure you wouldn't like to delay this case until you're old enough to vote?" Laughter erupted, louder this time. A few jurors exchanged looks, some shaking their heads. No one in this room expected much from her, but Olivia didn't move. She didn't shift her weight, she didn't let her eyes flicker, she simply stood there, calm, steady, unshaken. Her gaze swept the room, not with defiance, not with arrogance, but with quiet calculation. She saw it all, the judge's skepticism, the prosecutor's smug confidence, the jury's doubt, the audience waiting for her to crumble. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her chin and met Judge Reed's gaze. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was smooth and steady, each word sharp as a knife. "I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to reveal the truth." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The laughter stopped. Judge Reed studied her, expression unreadable. Over at the prosecution's table, Pierce's smirk faltered, just for a second. It was a tiny shift, barely noticeable. But Olivia saw it, and she knew. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. No one in this room, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the jury, had any idea what was about to happen next. In just 1 hour, they would witness something they had never seen before. A young lawyer standing alone, taking apart an entire case with nothing but the truth. And this was only the beginning. The air inside the courtroom was thick, heavy with unspoken certainty. This was the kind of case that had been seen 1,000 times before. The kind where the outcome had already been written long before the trial even began. At the center of it all sat Jason Walker, 19 years old, black, tired. He sat stiffly at the defense table, his fingers interlocked, his expression carefully neutral. But beneath the surface, there was an exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that came from knowing the odds were stacked against him before he even got the chance to speak. To most in the room, he was already guilty. The prosecution had made sure of that. They had painted him into a story that people expected. A stolen car, a police chase, a suspect resisting arrest. The details didn't need to be scrutinized, because the ending was always the same, and Jonathan Pierce knew that better than anyone. Sitting at the prosecution's table, Pierce looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent years perfecting the art of the easy conviction. A tailored suit, a crisp tie, a measured confidence. There was no doubt in his mind that this case was already his. Pierce had built his career on these cases. He knew how to shape a narrative, how to present just enough facts to make the jury feel certain, but not enough for them to ask questions. And he knew exactly how this would play out. Jason Walker wasn't a defendant. He was a statistic, a conviction waiting to happen. And then there was Judge Marcus Reed. A man who had seen everything in his courtroom, seasoned attorneys, desperate defendants, last-minute deals. He was the kind of judge who prided himself on experience, on control, on knowing exactly how justice should be handled. And yet, even for a man who had seen it all, there was something new about today's case. Not the charges, not the defendant, but the lawyer standing at the defense table. 18-year-old Olivia Carter. He studied her with the sharp gaze of a man who had spent his life measuring people, weighing them, assessing them, deciding their worth before they even spoke. And what he saw didn't impress him. She was young, too young. She didn't belong here, not in his courtroom. and certainly not standing alone, across from a prosecutor like Jonathan Pierce. She should have been nervous, intimidated, but she wasn't. She stood steady, composed, her eyes locked forward, not defiant, not cocky, just certain. And for the first time in his long career, Judge Reed felt something unexpected, a sliver of doubt. Because there was something in Olivia's stance, something in the way she held herself that told him she wasn't here to play a game. She was here to win. And that was something no one in this courtroom was ready for. Not Pierce, not the jury, not even Judge Reed himself. But they would be. Because what was about to happen next would change everything. The case against Jason Walker had been built to look solid, clean, simple, undeniable. At least that's how Jonathan Pierce wanted it to appear. He rose from his seat with deliberate ease, smoothing the cuff of his tailored sleeve before stepping toward the jury. Every movement was calculated, controlled, the mark of a man who had done this 1,000 times before and won. His voice, smooth and confident, carried through the courtroom like the opening act of a performance. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not complicated. He let the words settle, turning to face the jury, scanning their faces as if he could already see their verdict forming. The defendant, Jason Walker, was caught in possession of a stolen vehicle. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. And most importantly, a police officer saw him behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. It sounded damning. It felt damning. There was a shift in the air, a murmur rippling through the rows of spectators. On the surface, it seemed like an open and shut case, and that's exactly what Pierce wanted them to believe. He turned slightly, his tone firm but composed, as he began laying out the 3 key pieces of evidence, the foundation on which Jason Walker's conviction would be built. First, he continued, pacing slightly for effect, forensic analysis confirms that Jason Walker's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. He let the weight of that statement hang in the air, then took a measured step forward. Not just anywhere inside the car, not on the door handle, not on the window. He turned his attention back to the jury. The steering wheel. There it was, the unspoken conclusion. If his hands were on the wheel, then he must have driven it. If he drove it, then he must have stolen it. And just like that, Pierce had planted the first seed in the jury's mind. Jason Walker wasn't just in the car. He was behind the wheel. Pierce picked up a manila folder from the prosecution's table, tapping it lightly in his palm as he spoke. Second, we have sworn testimony from Officer Daniel Ruiz. He paused, flipping open the folder as if to remind himself of the facts, as if he hadn't already memorized them. Officer Ruiz, a law enforcement professional with over 15 years of experience, personally saw the defendant behind the wheel of the stolen car. Another pause. Another calculated glance toward the jury. A police officer had seen Jason in the driver's seat. That, to most people in the room, would be enough. Because when a police officer makes a statement, it's treated as fact. No questions. No doubt. And Pierce knew that. What he didn't say, what he didn't need to say, was that there was no body cam footage of this sighting, no dash cam recording, no security footage. All they had was a name on a report. But in a courtroom like this, that was usually more than enough. Then, the final nail in the coffin. Pierce turned slightly, this time gesturing toward Jason. Not in anger, not aggressively, but with the casual indifference of someone stating the obvious. Finally, when officers arrived at the scene, the defendant was found just a few blocks away. He was walking quickly, looking over his shoulder, and when the officers approached, he ran. The words landed like a gavel strike. Ran. One word. One action. One assumption. The courtroom was silent for a beat, the weight of the accusation hanging thick in the air. Because running meant guilt. It didn't matter why Jason ran. It didn't matter if the flashing red and blue lights triggered something deep in his bones, if his body had moved before his mind could reason through the moment, if it was fear, if it was instinct, if it was survival. All that mattered was that he ran. And now, he was here. Seated at the defense table, stiff-backed and silent, his very presence a reminder of how these cases always seem to play out the same way. A young black man. A crime. A courtroom where the decision had already been made long before the trial began. Pierce closed the folder in his hands with a soft but deliberate snap, setting it down gently on the table. a symbolic act, as if to say the case was already settled. Then, turning back to the jury, he gave them one last measured nod. The evidence speaks for itself. And for a long, heavy moment, everyone in that courtroom believed him. There was no suspense in this case. Not for them. Not for the people sitting in the gallery, their expressions indifferent, arms crossed over their chests as they settled in for what they expected to be a routine legal proceeding. Not for the jury, whose gazes occasionally flickered toward Jason Walker, but never with curiosity, only with the quiet, resigned certainty of people who believed they already knew the ending. Not even for Judge Marcus Reed, whose fingers tapped idly against his desk, the rhythmic sound almost dismissive. He had seen this play out before, a prosecutor delivering an airtight case, a black defendant accused of a crime, a trial that wasn't really a trial, just a formality on the way to a conviction. There was nothing surprising about a young man being accused of stealing a car. There was nothing unusual about the so-called evidence against him. There was nothing to suggest that this case required more than a brief deliberation before the inevitable verdict was delivered. And yet, in the middle of it all, Olivia Carter sat still. She didn't fidget. She didn't shift in her chair. She didn't glance toward the jury, didn't look at Jason, didn't react to the unspoken certainty in the room. She just watched. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers barely curled. Her breathing was slow, steady. Her eyes moved, not in anxious flickers, but with purpose. Because while they had all already decided how this was going to end, Olivia Carter had not. And in the silence that followed Jonathan Pierce's closing statement, she caught everything. The way a woman in the second row of the gallery barely suppressed a yawn, already bored before the defense had even begun. The way one of the jurors, a man in his 50s with deep lines on his face, sat with his arms crossed, unmoving, his mind made up before the trial had even started. The way Judge Reed hadn't even looked at her yet, his gaze still on Pierce, because to him, she was an afterthought. They weren't waiting for her argument. They were waiting for her failure. She could feel it in the room. The weight of their assumption. The quiet expectation that she would stumble, falter, expose herself as nothing more than a child trying to play an adult's game. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this courtroom, not in this case. Not standing between a man they had already condemned and the conviction they believed he deserved. Jason felt it, too. His hands, folded together on the table, barely moved. He had sat through every minute of this trial with the same unreadable expression. The same heavy stillness of a man who had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the only defense that mattered. But now, for the first time, he turned his head just slightly, looking at Olivia, not expectantly, not hopefully, but with quiet curiosity. Because she wasn't shifting uncomfortably. She wasn't blinking too much or adjusting her notes. She wasn't acting like someone who was about to lose. She was thinking. And that was dangerous. Because they had expected an argument. They had expected emotion. They had expected the kind of youthful arrogance that came from someone too inexperienced to know they were outmatched. What they hadn't expected was patience. And that patience, that calm, surgical precision, would be what tore this case apart. Olivia's fingers tapped softly against the table. Just once. A single movement. Then she looked up, and for the first time, Judge Reed met her gaze. The moment stretched between them, brief but weighted. He hadn't expected her to be composed. He hadn't expected stillness. And for the first time since this trial began, he hesitated. Jonathan Pierce was in his element. Standing tall before the jury, his presence commanded the room. His confidence wasn't just visible. It was woven into the way he carried himself, into the measured cadence of his speech, into the way his eyes scanned the jury as if he already knew they were convinced. To him, this was textbook prosecution. An easy case. A perfect conviction. Pierce clasped his hands together, allowing a brief pause before delivering his final calculated words. The facts are clear. The evidence is irrefutable. And the law? He gave the slightest shake of his head, exhaling as if he almost felt sorry for how simple this all was. The law is on our side. He let that statement settle in the air, deliberate and final. A few members of the jury exchanged glances. One of them, an older man with graying hair, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Pierce saw it. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned back toward the bench, straightening his tie as he delivered the final stroke of his argument. "The prosecution rests, Your Honor." Judge Marcus Reed exhaled slowly, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. His fingers interlocked as he glanced toward the defense table, toward Olivia Carter. The room, which had been filled with the steady rhythm of Pierce's voice for the past several minutes, was now eerily silent. All eyes followed the judge's gaze, falling onto the young woman who had yet to speak. Judge Reed's brow furrowed slightly, his voice carrying a tone that, despite his best efforts, bordered on skepticism. "Miss Carter." A pause. "Do you have a response?" Olivia didn't react immediately. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. She could hear the unspoken assumptions in the room, the silent certainty that she had nothing to offer in return, that she was about to stumble through an unconvincing rebuttal, that she was out of her depth and about to prove it. But she didn't rush. Instead, she reached for the folder in front of her, her movements slow, deliberate. She stood, not hurriedly, not awkwardly, steady, measured, in control. The weight of the courtroom did not sit on her shoulders. It sat around her, waiting. She let her gaze move just once across the jury, across the gallery, across the prosecution's table where Pierce stood, hands folded, watching her with what could only be described as professional amusement. And then finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, not loud, not defensive, just precise. "I have a few questions." She let the sentence linger for just a breath, flipping open the folder in her hands. Then, with the kind of certainty that didn't need to be forced, she looked Pierce directly in the eye. "About the evidence." The weight of silence settled over the courtroom. For the past hour, Jonathan Pierce had dictated the rhythm of this trial. His voice had filled the space, confident and assured, wrapping the jury in a narrative they had no reason to question. But now, the room was waiting for Olivia Carter. Judge Marcus Reed exhaled, his fingers lacing together as he leaned slightly forward. His voice was steady, but the flicker of skepticism hadn't left his eyes. "Miss Carter," he said, "you may proceed." Olivia didn't rush. She reached for her folder, her movements precise, unhurried. The weight of expectation in the room pressed against her, but she bore it with the kind of stillness that made people nervous. When she finally looked up, she didn't glance toward the judge, the jury, or even her client. She looked directly at Jonathan Pierce. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice controlled, measured. "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw my client behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle. That's a crucial piece of your case, correct?" Pierce's expression remained impassive, but Olivia caught the slight shift in his stance. A subtle weight adjustment, the kind that only someone paying very close attention would notice. "That is correct," Olivia nodded. "And Officer Ruiz filed a report confirming his presence at the scene?" "He did." She turned a page in her file, then let a pause stretch. Not long enough to be awkward, but long enough to make the room lean in. "Then you won't mind if we verify his vehicle's GPS records?" The reaction was small, but Olivia saw it. A slight, almost imperceptible hesitation before Pierce responded. A flicker of something behind his eyes, surprise maybe, or irritation. He hadn't expected that. Judge Reed lifted an eyebrow. "GPS records?" Olivia shifted, addressing the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. Every police vehicle is equipped with a GPS tracking system, which automatically logs its location. If Officer Ruiz was at the scene, then his vehicle's records will confirm it." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Pierce's jaw tightened slightly, but when he spoke, his voice was smooth. "Of course, the prosecution has nothing to hide." But Olivia knew better. He didn't like this. She had just introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for. And for the first time since this trial began, Jonathan Pierce was no longer in complete control. The minutes stretched. The clerk retrieved the requested GPS data, handing a printed report to Judge Reed. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the page. His expression remained neutral, but the way he stopped, his eyes lingering on the data just a second too long, did not go unnoticed. "Miss Carter," he said after a moment, "would you like to read the findings?" Olivia took the paper from him, then turned toward the jury. She could feel the energy in the room shifting. The jury, once passive, was now watching her closely. The gallery had stopped whispering. Even Pierce's posture had changed, his hands no longer folded as loosely as before. And then she spoke. According to these records, Officer Ruiz's vehicle was, a pause, 5 miles away from the crime scene at the time of the alleged sighting. The words landed like a dropped gavel, a sharp inhale from the gallery, a low murmur spreading across the room. On the jury bench, one of the jurors, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, shifted in her seat. At the prosecution's table, Pierce's fingers curled slightly against the wood. Olivia didn't let up. She turned back to Pierce, her voice still calm, but now carrying an unmistakable edge. Your key witness wasn't even there. She let it settle, the weight of it, the implications, the crack that had just formed in Pierce's case. Then, after just the right amount of silence, she tilted her head slightly and delivered the final blow. So tell me, Mr. Pierce, what else in your case isn't real? The courtroom was shifting. It wasn't loud. There were no outbursts, no gasps, but Olivia Carter could feel it. It was in the way the jury sat forward, their postures no longer rigid but subtly engaged. It was in the way the murmurs in the gallery had faded into a tense, waiting silence. It was in Jonathan Pierce's fingers, now pressed just a little too tightly against the edges of his file. She had cracked one piece of his case. Now, she was about to crack another. She stepped forward, placing her hands lightly on the defense table. She didn't rush. She didn't fill the silence. She let it sit, let it weigh down on the room. Then, when she finally spoke, her voice was measured, controlled, but sharp enough to cut through the air. The prosecution has argued that my client's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. She let that settle. They want you to believe that this single fact proves he stole the car. A pause. But let's think about what that really means. She turned slightly, her gaze locking onto the jury. Imagine you walk into a clothing store. The words landed gently, simple, familiar. A scenario anyone could relate to. You see a jacket you like. You pick it up, feel the material, maybe even try it on. Then you decide it's not for you, so you put it back and leave. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational. A few hours later, someone else comes in and steals that jacket. She let the visual settle in their minds before she tilted her head slightly. Should you be arrested? A shift. A slight lean forward from juror number 3, an older man with tired eyes. A quick glance exchanged between jurors 6 and 9, something unspoken passing between them. A flicker of hesitation on Pierce's face. Olivia let them process. Then, finally, she spoke again. Touching something does not mean you stole it. A beat of silence. Fingerprints do not prove theft, they prove contact, nothing more. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. And if we start convicting people based solely on that, she let her next words land with deliberate weight, then we're all guilty of crimes we never committed. For the first time, the jury wasn't just listening, they were considering, processing. The certainty that had once coated Jonathan Pierce's case was beginning to thin. At the prosecution's table, Pierce's jaw tightened. It wasn't a reaction anyone else would have noticed. But Olivia noticed, and she knew exactly what it meant. She wasn't just disproving one part of his argument. She was making the jury question all of it. And that was far more dangerous. The air inside the courtroom had shifted. It wasn't a loud or obvious change, but Olivia Carter could feel it. It was in the way the jury sat forward, their expressions no longer detached but engaged, their eyes flicking between her and Jonathan Pierce with something close to uncertainty. It was in the way the gallery had fallen into an expectant hush, no longer whispering, no longer convinced of an inevitable conviction. And it was in Pierce's posture, the slow curling of his fingers around the edge of his notes, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He had spent his career controlling narratives, leading juries, winning. But now, for the first time, he was losing his grip. And he knew it. Pierce inhaled sharply, adjusting his tie as if steadying himself. Then, with a forced chuckle, he turned to Olivia. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "you're certainly persistent. I'll give you that." A pause. Then his expression hardened. But persistence is not the same as knowledge. His gaze swept the jury, as if silently reminding them who the real expert in this room was. He took a step forward, folding his hands together, his tone dropping into something lower, something deliberate, something meant to put her in her place. "You are a child." The words cut through the air, sharp and undeniable. A single syllable that held years of dismissal, Years of condescension, years of the same belief that youth was a weakness, that experience alone was authority. A flicker of discomfort passed through the jury. One juror, a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes, shifted slightly in her seat. Another, an older man with graying hair, frowned, his gaze flicking from Pierce to Olivia, as if reassessing something. At the judge's bench, Marcus Reed's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't speak, but Olivia saw it, a moment of consideration, a second of recalibration. Pierce didn't. He was too focused on her. You may be book smart, but you do not understand the law the way I do, the way real attorneys do. The insult wrapped in formality, the dismissal disguised as experience, the attempt to push her back down. But Olivia Carter didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't react at all. And that was worse than anger, because it meant his words had landed on nothing. She tilted her head just slightly. Then when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, cold. Then let the evidence speak. A pause. A small one. Just enough. If my arguments are weak, they will fall apart under scrutiny. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the room, not in challenge but in certainty. If my logic is flawed, the facts will expose it. And then, in a voice just quiet enough to force everyone to listen, she delivered the final blow. But if I am right, a slow blink, then it is not my understanding of the law that is lacking. Silence. Absolute, heavy, unforgiving. Pierce stiffened, because the moment he had made this personal, he had lost. And now everyone in that courtroom knew it. Jonathan Pierce was losing his grip, not in a way the jury could immediately recognize, not yet. But Olivia Carter could see it. The way he adjusted his tie, a little too tight this time. The fingers drumming lightly on his folder, rhythmic, controlled, but betraying something beneath. The confidence in his stance, still present but no longer effortless. He knew what was happening. He was slipping. And he wasn't going down without a fight. Pierce inhaled deeply, centering himself before stepping forward. His voice, smooth and practiced, carried the weight of someone trying to reclaim his authority. Let's not lose sight of what this case is really about. His gaze swept across the jury, measured and intentional. We cannot allow distractions to cloud the truth. A pause, a slow shake of his head. This case is not about clever analogies or hypotheticals. It is not about grandstanding or theatrics. It is about facts. The words were deliberate. His tone sharpened with just enough authority to remind them why they should believe him. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge Olivia without fully facing her, as if dismissing her presence without outright saying it. The facts remain unchanged. The defendant's fingerprints were found inside a stolen vehicle. He was seen near the crime scene. He ran from the police. Each statement was delivered with finality, each one punctuated as if to erase every doubt Olivia had introduced. A beat of silence. And now, because of a few technical inconsistencies, the defense would have you believe that none of this matters? His expression hardened, disappointment laced in his voice. Justice is not about dissecting a case until nothing is left. It is about seeing the truth for what it is, even when distractions are thrown in our path. He turned fully to the jury now, stepping closer, his voice dipping just slightly, low enough to feel personal, persuasive. You've heard the facts. You've seen the evidence. Do not let this turn into something it's not. For a moment, just a moment, it almost worked. The jury remained still, but there was hesitation in their eyes, a flicker of uncertainty Olivia could not ignore. Pierce saw it too. He latched onto it, straightening, confidence returning to his stance. But Olivia did not interrupt. She let him believe it was working. She let him have this moment, because in just a few seconds, she was going to take it away. For good. For a moment, Pierce had the jury exactly where he wanted them. He had pulled them back, steered them towards certainty, wrapped his case in the kind of authoritative finality that left little room for doubt. But that moment was fleeting, because Olivia Carter was about to take it all away. She exhaled softly, a controlled breath, then picked up a single document from her table. No dramatics, no raised voice. Just a simple movement that, in the thick silence of the courtroom, felt heavier than it should have. I'd like to submit one last piece of evidence into the record, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it now. Something different. Finality. Judge Reed glanced at her, then at the paper in her hand. Proceed, She stepped forward, offering the document to the bailiff, who carried it across the courtroom and placed it in front of Reed. Pierce shifted slightly at the prosecution's table, his eyes narrowing. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the page, his brow furrowed. "This is the original statement from the registered owner of the stolen vehicle," Olivia explained, her voice clear and measured. "The statement he gave to police the night his car was reported missing." She turned slightly, her gaze landing directly on Pierce now. "And yet, curiously, this document is not part of the prosecution's case file." The weight of her words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Pierce straightened, a forced breath leaving his lips. "That's ridiculous," he scoffed. "Every relevant report was included in the case file." "Were they?" Olivia cut in, her voice still calm. "Then let's read what's in this one, shall we?" Judge Reed had already turned back to the page, his lips pressing into a thin line as his eyes skimmed the document. The deepening lines on his forehead were the only indication that something was wrong. Something very wrong. Olivia didn't wait. She turned to the jury, speaking as if she were laying out something simple, something they should have known all along. "The prosecution built their case around an assumption," she said. "An assumption that my client was guilty based on where he was, based on how he reacted, based on the way he looked." She let that sit for just a second before continuing. "But here's the problem with assumptions. They fall apart when confronted with facts." She turned back to the judge, who was still staring at the page in his hands. "Your Honor, would you mind reading what the vehicle's owner originally told police about the suspect he saw stealing his car?" Judge Reed hesitated for half a second. Then, slowly, he looked up. His gaze landed on Pierce first, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Then, finally, he turned to the courtroom. His voice, when he spoke, was lower than before. "The registered owner of the vehicle," he read, "stated that the suspect who stole his car was a young white male." A silence fell over the room, thick and absolute. No murmurs, no gasps. Just the weight of the words settling into every corner of that courtroom. The jury, frozen. The gallery, unmoving. Jonathan Pierce, speechless. And Olivia Carter? She hadn't moved, because she had already known. The truth had been hidden, but not anymore. Silence, that was all that remained. No murmurs, no objections, no sharp retorts from Jonathan Pierce. Just the weight of reality crashing down. The truth once buried, now laid bare for all to see. The jury, once so certain, now looked shaken. The gallery, once buzzing with quiet confidence, sat frozen, absorbing the revelation that had shattered everything they thought they knew about this case. And at the prosecution's table, Jonathan Pierce was unraveling. Not in a way that was loud or dramatic, but in small, damning ways. The stiffening of his posture, the way his fingers curled into his palm, the slight tremor in his breath. For the first time in this trial, he had nothing to say. Judge Reed, still gripping the document Olivia had presented, exhaled slowly. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Mr. Pierce," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that demanded an answer. "Why was this information not included in the case file?" Pierce blinked. His mouth opened, then closed, a hesitation, a misstep. He tried again, but the words wouldn't come. He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Your Honor, there must have been a clerical error," he managed, his voice not as strong as before. "The prosecution had no intention of withholding evidence." Judge Reed's brow lifted, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "A clerical error," he repeated. Pierce nodded quickly, latching onto the explanation. "Yes, Your Honor, a mistake, an oversight." The words fell flat. No one in that courtroom believed them. Not the judge, not the jury, not even himself. At the defense table, Olivia Carter remained still. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply watched, because the case had already decided itself. Jason Walker, seated beside her, exhaled. His fingers, clenched together for what felt like a lifetime, finally relaxed. He hadn't moved much, hadn't spoken. But now, for the first time, he let himself breathe. Judge Reed let out a sharp exhale, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. His fingers tapped against the desk, then moved toward the gavel. A pause, a second of silence, one last moment where time seemed to stop. Then, the gavel struck wood, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a final, decisive blow. "The court hereby finds the defendant, Jason Walker, not guilty." The words landed like thunder. Jason inhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened. His eyes flickered to Olivia, then the judge, then the jury. The people who had held his future in their hands. And then, slowly, as if afraid to believe it, he let his shoulders drop. It was over. The weight, the one that had settled in his chest, pressing down on him since the moment he was accused, was gone. A murmur spread through the gallery. Some leaned into hushed whispers. Others simply sat there, stunned. At the prosecution's table, Jonathan Pierce didn't move. His case had collapsed. His authority had been shattered. And he was just standing in the wreckage. Olivia turned to Jason, her voice softer now. "It's done," she said simply. He nodded, his fingers still gripping the table, as if testing whether the moment was real. Then, with a slow exhale, he pushed himself to his feet. Olivia followed. The bailiff moved to escort Jason out, but this time, it wasn't to a holding cell. This time, he was walking free. Olivia didn't look back. She didn't need to, because the fight was over, and she had won. For a heartbeat, the courtroom held its breath. Then it erupted. The murmurs that had been contained, the tension that had been stretched too tight, all snapped at once. Some gasped. Others whispered in disbelief. A few clapped, tentative at first, then growing louder. A woman in the back wiped at her eyes, shaking her head as if she had just witnessed the impossible. But at the center of it all, Jason Walker didn't move. He sat there, frozen, his fingers still gripping the edge of the table. His chest rose and fell unevenly, as if he was forcing himself to breathe. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on the judge's bench. It took him a second to understand, another second to accept. And then his shoulders trembled. A sharp inhale. His hand came up, not to his face but to his mouth, as if trying to hold something in. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, blurring his vision. Freedom. For months, he had been told he didn't have a future, that his story would end here, in a courtroom, in a prison cell, in a place where people like him didn't win. And yet, here he was, not guilty. A sound broke from his throat, a strangled mixture of laughter and disbelief. He turned, blinking rapidly, as if searching for proof that this moment was real. His gaze landed on Olivia. She wasn't looking at him. She was calmly gathering her papers, stacking them neatly, methodically. No celebration, no victory speech, just quiet efficiency. Because to Olivia Carter, this wasn't about proving herself, it was about proving him, that he was more than this case. That his life wasn't meant to be decided by assumptions and half-truths. That justice still existed, even when the world said it didn't. Jason exhaled, shaking his head as a quiet, shaky laugh escaped. He swiped at his face, wiping away the dampness before finally pushing back from the table. He stood. People reached for him, his mother, a friend, someone from the gallery, but he barely registered them. He turned to Olivia, his voice hoarse. "You." He stopped, shook his head again, laughing breathlessly. "You saved me." Olivia finally looked up, and for the first time in this entire trial, she smiled. The noise in the courtroom had yet to settle, but amidst the waves of murmurs and the scattered applause, Judge Marcus Reed remained still. His gaze lingered on Olivia Carter as she finished gathering her papers. She hadn't reacted like most lawyers would have after such a victory. No smug grin, no triumphant glance at the jury. No outward sign that she had just done the impossible. Instead, she moved with quiet precision, her face composed, her hands steady. Judge Reed had watched her throughout this trial, had measured her, had doubted her, had dismissed her at times. But now he was seeing her. Not as a young lawyer trying to prove herself, not as an upstart challenging the system, but as a force, a professional, a defender of justice. His fingers drummed once against the bench, thoughtful. Then, finally, after a long pause, he gave her a single, slow nod. Not of authority, not of acknowledgement, but of respect. Olivia saw it. She met his gaze just for a second. Then she turned and walked away. The moment Olivia stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the reporters were waiting. Microphones, cameras, a rush of bodies pressing forward, voices overlapping in a blur of excitement and urgency. Olivia Carter. The crowd swarmed, cameras flashing, questions thrown at her from every direction. A man in a navy suit leaned forward, microphone raised. "Miss Carter, how does it feel to have defeated Jonathan Pierce in court?" Another voice, sharp and eager. "Did you ever doubt you'd win? What do you say to those who didn't believe in you?" Is this the beginning of your legal legacy? The questions came fast, relentless, demanding sound bites, looking for headlines. Olivia took a breath. She could have smiled. She could have said something clever, something memorable, something designed to make tomorrow's front pages. But instead, she simply said the truth. The cameras flashed. The voices swirled around her, a barrage of questions, each one eager to claim the first headline, the first soundbite. Miss Carter, how does it feel to have defeated Jonathan Pierce in court? Did you ever doubt you'd win? What do you say to those who didn't believe in you? Is this the beginning of your legal legacy? But Olivia Carter didn't rush. She stood there, poised, composed, her fingers still loosely gripping the stack of papers she had carried out of that courtroom. For the first time since the verdict was read, she allowed herself to take in the moment. Jason was free. Pierce was silent. And justice had prevailed. Not because of power, not because of influence, but because the truth had been fought for. She exhaled, a slow, steady breath. Then, finally, she smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just a quiet, knowing smile, the kind that comes from standing firm in what is right. Her voice was calm, unwavering. I didn't defeat anyone. A pause. I only defended justice. The reporters hesitated, as if expecting more. Something bigger, something bolder. But there was nothing else to say, because that was the truth. And sometimes the truth was enough. The world would talk about this case for days, weeks, maybe even years. Some would call it a landmark moment. Some would call it an upset. Some would wonder how an 18-year-old girl had stood against an entire system and won. But Olivia Carter wasn't thinking about any of that. Because this wasn't just about one case. One man, one verdict. Justice was not a moment. It was a fight. A fight that would never be over. And as long as it needed to be fought, she would be there. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit the like button to show your support, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us why justice matters. Your support isn't just about numbers, it's what keeps us going, what fuels us to bring you powerful, meaningful content. Together, we can keep these stories alive. Together, we can make a difference. Justice is a fight we win together. Are you in?